Why South Sudan? An Every Village podcast where we answer questions about the world's youngest nation. The question of the day is, why is there so much fighting in South Sudan? Hey everyone, my name is Tiana Johnston, and I am the host of this podcast called Why South Sudan. I have Andrew Brown, Executive Director of Every Village, here with me again.
Hey, Tiana. Good to be back.
Welcome back.
Thanks for keeping inviting me.
Yes, you've done very well so far, so I think I'll keep you around for a bit.
Okay, good.
So today is a really great day. I am actually excited to dive into today's topic. So actually 2 episodes ago, you very slightly mentioned that South Sudan is a war-torn nation. And so I thought, you know what, we should really dive into that and talk a little bit about it. I know you've talked about the history, which of course includes a lot of fighting that's happened. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on why there is so much fighting in South Sudan.
Yeah, and it's a tough topic because there's so many layers to this, as there is typically. Many nations in Africa have experienced a lot of fighting, but South Sudan particularly so. And if you were able to listen to the History of South Sudan episode, you heard that over the period of, independence from British rule in 1957 to today, the region of Southern Sudan, which became its own nation in 2011, South Sudan, but that entire region has only experienced probably about 15, maybe 20 years of peace in that whole time. And so it's just been constant state of unrest and violence. And it builds on itself, and that's the hard thing. Where the genesis of it began, I think this is a much bigger, broader topic that many books probably have been written about colonization and the impact of colonization. And there was, some development aspects that came for good in these nations, but obviously a lot of the colonial regions were the boundaries were divided without any thought towards tribal lines or ethnicity or heritage. It was just kind of blockaded based on a map, based on in this case the British Empire's best interests. And so Sudan was the colony that was formed, and at that time Sudan was the largest country in Africa, and it's a wildly diverse nation and a huge nation. And when you combine Sudan and South Sudan, and really kind of right down the middle, you've got a huge dividing line between Arab Africans and Native Africans, and so those early years of war were very much based on these different layers. There was ethnic layers, there was religious layers, there was natural resources, and tribalism within, and so it's led to a lot of challenges. There's a large oil reservoirs that are right in the middle of the nation, and so that has continued. Obviously, money is at the root of a lot of conflict, right? Mm-hmm. Then there's the religious component with Islam and Christianity. It's maybe oversimplifying it because, of course, there's African traditional religion as well, animism mixed in there. But that has a factor, is a factor still today. And then there's the ethnic and tribal tension. And so when you go down to the tribal level, it's not just one group versus another group, but it splinters pretty quickly. South Sudan has 64 tribes in it. And so even within South Sudan, there's, civil unrest, and there's different, issues that pop up every year across tribes. And then you can go an even lower level to clan. And so within tribes, they're broken down even deeper into clans. And every year in South Sudan, there's inter-clan fighting. So with the same tribes fighting each other, but it's based on clan conflict. And so what is the root of all that? Well, you look at the large geopolitical level that we just talked about, but let me go more to the organic, the root level in the communities. And I would say so much of it is rooted in this answer you might not expect, but so much of it is rooted in the identity of a man and a woman in society. Traditionally in South Sudan, and when I say traditionally, I should say even today in South Sudan, women are viewed as property. And I that's not an antiquated notion. That is the current notion in South Sudan. And if you talk to the average man in South Sudan, even in churches, that is the expectation. I've heard a South Sudanese man, a Christian man, describe that buying a wife is like buying a Coke, you know, and so because women are viewed as property, that a husband sells his daughter, a father sells his daughter basically, and the husband buys the wife by paying a large dowry payment, then the husband has rights to do with his wife what he wants. And so the average family in South Sudan, most men have more than one wife, or if they don't have more than one wife, it's because they don't have enough money yet to get another wife. Almost all men in South Sudan have the aspirations to have more than one wife. And again, that's even within the church. And so what ends up happening is that you have these homes where you've got, they call them sister wives, but you've got multiple wives that are in this compound raising their own children. And we read about it in Scripture. You know, Leah and Rachel had a lot of conflict, and their children had conflict with one another because that's not God's natural way. And so you have a lot of conflict in the home, domestic conflict between, siblings or half siblings. You've got conflict between the sister wives, in over their husband's affections and attention and inheritance and all these things. So you've got conflict within the home, but the other side of this is the dowry payments, because they're very high, and so a man has to pay the father for his wife, and these are dowry payments. They're set so high that most men never pay them off. They're in permanent debt to their in-laws, and what will end up happening is that you've got these grown men that have been married for even decades, and their father-in-law will want more of the dowry paid, and so he'll demand it of his son-in-law. And if he doesn't pay a portion of the dowry, the next kind of installment that's agreed upon in that moment, then he'll be arrested, and the father-in-law will have his son-in-law arrested, and this happens again and again and again. Well, what are the dowry payments? It's not as simple as just cash. It is mostly cows, and this is where we're getting now more to the heart of so much conflict in South Sudan, because men have to buy their wives by paying cows, and we're talking about sometimes 30 cows, sometimes 100 cows. I mean, it really can depend on the price of the wife and the wealth of the family. But these cows are expensive, and so typically a man, he has to look to his father. Does his father have enough cows to help him pay for his bride? Well, if he comes from a wealthy family, maybe. The thing is in South Sudan, they also follow that, it's the oldest brother gets married first. So maybe the oldest brother might have enough cows to get married, but then what happens to the second son? Maybe his father's cows are depleted. And what's he going to do? Is he going to remain single for, years and years? Or is he going to force the issue and go and steal cows from somebody else? And so cattle raiding is a big issue, and it's all related to dowry payments. And so that's a very common deal. Another thing that's so common in South Sudan is that they follow a practice where if a man dies and leaves a wife, then his next brother in line is going to marry that woman to perpetuate the line for his dead brother. Well, that woman is not really technically considered that man's wife, and so he'll live with her for years and produce children with her for years. But for him to really gain respect to have his own wife and his own children in the years to come, he's planning on marrying another woman, but he has to again collect enough cows to be able to do that, and that can take years to happen. And so the cattle raiding happens often, and then what happens? The clan, the family that's cows were stolen, well, they have to take revenge, and so they'll come back and they'll take revenge, and the South Sudanese have a saying that it basically translates to "there's always war in our hearts," and that is when somebody takes advantage of you. Culturally, it's wrong to forgive them. Culturally, it's wrong to let it go. Instead, you're to hold war in your hearts until revenge is taken. And that might not be immediate. It could be years from now, but it is expected that you will take revenge at some point. And so this creates a cycle of violence. And so year after year, you have that. And then, other cattle-related violence that happens. And we've experienced these things at every village, unfortunately, a staff being caught up in that or being affected by it. But Another common one is the largest tribes in South Sudan are cattle keeping tribes, and so it's a big deal. But there's 64 tribes. There's other tribes that aren't cattle keepers; they're farmers.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the areas where we work in Mavolo, they don't keep cows, but they grow farms. Well, one of our radio manager a few years ago, his brothers got caught up in fighting in a revenge attack. They were both killed because what happens is the cattle keeping tribes will need to take their cows during the dry season to rivers, and so they'll take them in their large herds and walk them for miles and miles and miles to a river point, and they're walking through farms of other tribes, and they're destroying the crops. And so then the farmers go and fight them to try to protect their crops, and then the cattle keepers fight them, and it just goes back and forth. And this is very, very common. And so, these are issues that are foreign to us in America because we don't live in an agrarian society anymore. We're not dependent on our livestock the same way. And yet, when you read the scriptures, you see it. There's the story in the scriptures of Isaac. Isaac's men fighting with other men. I think it's Abimelech's men over water wells. That's still very, very common. I think I mentioned in one of the episodes about water how there's just so many long lines to collect water at these water wells that women end up fighting often because I've gone to a water well in South Sudan where they have these yellow jerry cans or buckets, whatever the ladies can fill with the water in, and I've seen they line them up just like you would at the DMV to get your driver's license renewed or something, and they line them up, and there's sometimes 30, 40, 50 buckets that are lined up, and they're having to wait for hours to get water in very populated areas. Well, what happens if you're just having a bad day or you need to be somewhere or whatever? Well, it's going to cause fighting or conflict if somebody comes in. So, I mean, all the South Sudanese know from childhood is conflict. And because they grow up in these homes where there's conflict in the home, because they experience it all around them, they're in some ways they're more comfortable in a conflict setting. The South Sudanese are very, not all the tribes, but the dominant tribes are very aggressive tribes. I love them, but they're very aggressive. They're very blunt. They don't mind conflict at all, and so all these things lead up to, small level community squabbles that grow into, inter-community fighting that grow into national violence and war. And so, what's the answer to all this? And that is, it starts at a heart level. Mm-hmm. And we know it's the gospel. And that's not an overly simplified answer. That's the truth. It is the gospel, but it's the gospel working itself into the heart level. And there are scriptures, so many scriptures where Christ says, hey, forgive because I've forgiven you. And if you don't forgive your brother, then neither will my Father forgive you in heaven, right? There's a lot of different scriptures like that. Those are critical for all of us to know and understand. And in South Sudan, those are going to be the key, because when they experience the forgiveness of Christ, then they truly are given the freedom and the mandate to forgive their brothers or sisters when they're wronged. But that's a completely antithetical concept to their cultural norm, right? And so the gospel is the answer to that, but it's also going to take years. This isn't going to be quick. One of the things that I came to realize is just, the adult generation of today in South Sudan have seen so many horrors. The president of Sudan, who was ousted, a few years ago, and now Sudan is in conflict themselves. But Omar Bashir was the president of Sudan when South Sudan was part of that nation, and he was indicted for war crimes and for genocide. Okay, so the Southern Sudanese people have seen terrible things. Even in the 1990s, South Sudanese were being sold into slavery to the north. It was very, very common practice. They were being kidnapped and sold into slavery, and I could go on, but they've seen terrible things, and they're filled with such brokenness, such hatred, such, so many thoughts of revenge and lack of forgiveness, and you can understand it. They've seen a lot of trauma, and so there needs to be a lot of trauma healing, a lot of counseling, and by God's grace, I've seen many South Sudanese adults come out of those dark places and heal and become people of light and grace. And that's an amazing thing. But as a whole, this generation is so filled with that. That's all they know. It's going to be tough for the nation to really advance a whole lot forward in these days. But that's why investing in the next generation is so important. It's praying and working towards seeing kids today growing up in homes that are more stable, growing up in homes that are more loving, growing up in communities that are more forgiving, growing up in a nation that has more peace and stability and prosperity. And as kids start to grow up in that environment, it gives them an opportunity to flourish. And as they're trained from a young age in the Word of God, then they will at a young age understand the importance of forgiveness. Whereas I've mentioned a couple times in these episodes that the current generation of adults, they're the first generation believers. So they've learned it, but they've learned it as adults after all these things happen. The kids today can learn it as kids before anything major happens in their life, and that changes everything. So, that's kind of gone on and on, but there's just it's a complicated subject. We don't know all the answers, but we do see, the answer, and that's the thing. We don't have all the answers, but we see the one answer, and that's the most important thing.
I love how you tied it back to just the need of the gospel, because it's so true. I mean, there's, even as you were talking, I was just thinking through how much is connected to just self-preservation and knowing that, I mean, parents are only doing what they were taught, which is very similar here in America and across the whole world. But I also know, I think, and you mentioned it earlier too, but I think tribalism really, really is a big thing. I know us for Every Village, we encountered that, the loss of that through Marco Agay, which was several years ago, knowing that that was a vengeance killing. And that was really, really hard. I don't know if you want to share a little story of that.
Yeah, so Marco was one of our radio staff members in Tanj, and a young guy, I think, in his early 20s, and just a sweet spirit, really tender heart. And that year, as is common, there had been fighting between two different communities just north of Tanj, and it related to the cattle raiding specifically. But then that's how it starts. But then people lose track, in some ways, because then there's revenge, and then there's revenge again, and back and forth, right? And this had been going on. This one was one of those years where it was just it was rough. It had gone for a while, and in fact, I remember that year we were at a pastor conference in Tanj, speaking, and at lunchtime, somebody got up to share the terrible news that a man it was in these communities who had been trying to be a peacemaker had been murdered that night in a revenge attack, and they just wanted to announce that and ask for prayer. And two of this man's relatives were in the audience, and they hadn't heard it yet, and so they heard it right then. And so, it was that same conflict that had gotten really bad, and part of it was that was the year where the president had gone from 10 states to overnight creating 32 states. And Tanj had become its own state with its own governor. Well, then that didn't seem to work very well for a while, and there was disagreement about it. And so then overnight, the president went back to 10 states. And so it was right in that season where Tanj was no longer a state, and there was no longer a governor, and there wasn't before that it had been a county seat, and so there was a commissioner, but this was in the kind of the gap between the governor being gone and no commissioner really being back in control. And so this fighting just went on and on and on until a new commissioner came back and kind of responded with some strength to end it. And so Marco was a part of a clan that, was involved in this, and he wasn't involved in the fighting at all, but he was driving on a motorbike up to a village to get some radio recordings, and he was on his way back into town, and he was kind of a celebrity, if you will, because he's on the radio. People know his name and so forth. So he was targeted in that. And it was just, tragic for Every Village to experience that firsthand, and the loss of Marco. And yet it's, a story that's been repeated for many, many years in South Sudan. And it's just a reminder that we're wholly dependent on God to change hearts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing about Marco. I was actually talking to one of our supporters that's how he actually really got connected to Every Village, was hearing the story of Marco. And really I kind of just related it to or connected it to here in America as just like gang, like gang violence, that it is like such a, like you will honor your gang and you will honor the people, so your clan basically, and that if one life is taken, that the other clan will get a life also taken, which is really, really sad to see. But I think that's the closest thing to relate it here into America to South Sudan.
That's right. Yeah, and so this I knew this going into this would be a heavy topic today, but there's so much hope too, and then that's for me. I don't know. That's where I'd like to end this, and it's just that despite the wars of the years of war, despite the pain that has been experienced in South Sudan, and I might not even say despite, I might say because of, God has made the South Sudanese incredibly strong, so resilient,
Mm-hmm.
and so willing to suffer for the gospel's sake. And so when the gospel penetrates this nation and penetrates hearts and starts to change people, and they experience the grace of Christ for themselves and the forgiveness of Christ for themselves, when they're able to forgive their enemies, then man, they're truly they're freed, and they're ready to go in a powerful way because of their past. And so I do see that. You talked about little stories of transformation, and I've seen it with our team. Most importantly over the years, again and again, and that's what excites me most, is visiting South Sudan and spending time with our team in their home or at work, but just seeing how they're growing in the Lord, seeing how they're working through some tragedies that I've never experienced. And I'm able to carry those with them now because I care with them and for them. But just I'm so proud of them because it is truly the light of the gospel shining in a dark place,
Mm-hmm.
and it does bring a lot of glory to God when you live in a countercultural way. And so there's hope, and that's what we choose to believe in and working for in South Sudan. That South Sudan can become a nation for Christ. It's a really unique opportunity that we're working in a nation that I like to say that South Sudan's entering its teenage years, and so we're going through the struggles. It's 12 years old now, and it'll be some ups and downs. There'll be some rocky moments in the years to come, but progressively we're looking at this trend line, just like we do with our kids when they're in their teenage years, and we look to the hope of them becoming adults, and and it's the same in South Sudan. We're looking forward to it's like Paul saying, hey, he longs for these people like a mother in the pains of childbirth. And I kind of feel the same way about South Sudan. Is they're in the pains of childbirth, but I see that it's producing something that is going to outlive all of us, and it's a beautiful, glorious thing. So.
Mm-hmm. I know when I think of, when I lived there, I really, I'd pray like, Lord, like miracle signs and wonders, like heal these people, make them, this crippled man walk, and, all of these things. I just wanted these big, healing experiences. And the Lord really, really, I think just like shook me a little bit and said, really showing me like how powerful the gospel is of heart transformation, and that's forgiveness. And that is the biggest, I think, especially in South Sudan, really seeing hearts changed, and people returning cows to the radio station, as a really just even partial as like confession of confessing their sin and bringing back. Or one of my really good friends, Christina Yabiz, she was having conflict with her neighbor, and she yeah, something in reference to like a garden. I think the kids actually messed up the neighbor's garden, and so the neighbor wanted to fight her. And she said she felt that she was called to walk in peace, and so she went over and she apologized, and she paid back what the damage was. And I was just like totally blown away, because that really is such a testimony of true faith, is forgiveness. And that's where, like you said, that freedom is found in forgiveness, and just how humility and forgiveness is the way of Christ.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much for sharing today. And we just invite everyone back to the next episode, which will be a little bit of a lighter topic. We will be answering the question, what does a typical day in South Sudan look like? All right, take care.